Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and once again, we are going to be looking into the infamous Fire Prism. So as you guys know, the Fire Prism started the edition off very strong. It was 125 points. It was basically the best and most cost-effective anti-large unit in the index, and they were dominating tournaments left to right. However, when September came along and the Prism got nerfed to 180 points from 150, and also got hit with a Phantasm nerf, meaning it could no longer be targeted with Phantasm, the Fire Prism stopped seeing as much competitive play. And I actually did a video covering this, predicting that you would see less Fire Prisms in competitive play because of it. Just because of the fact that now not only were they more expensive, but you had to spend those precious resources, those precious command points on Fire and Fade to essentially make sure that your Fire Prism survived. And, a few weeks later, we saw that people were indeed using less Fire Prisms. They were using more Warwalkers, they were using more Night Spinners and things like that instead. And also just due to the fact that, competitive opponents were getting better at predicting the lines of sight angles and stuff like that Fire Prisms could get on vulnerable targets. So right before we head into the next balanced data slate, I wanted to do a checkup with the Fire Prism because even though I don't think it is the most cost-effective anti-large platform anymore, I do think it is still quite a powerful tool that we can utilize in our lists, if built correctly. So what I want to do today in today's video is I simply want to do a quick overview of the Fire Prism. I know we've done this a couple times on the channel, but with every one of these videos, I do want to just refresh everybody's mind on the rules and things like that. So we are going to go over its stats, weapons, and special rules, the strengths and weaknesses of the Fire Prism, its combos and synergies with other units in our index, the different deployment and reserve shenanigans that you can pull with this thing that make it worth its weight in gold in some scenarios, and lastly, the role the Fire Prism plays in Eldar army and how to make the most out of it in your games. Alright, so let's start off with the stats. So average gravitate movement of 14 inches. It is fairly squishy with T9 and a 3+ save, which is why you have to keep it safe. You have to keep it in the back, out of line of sight, because, usually a couple of last cannons or things like that will bring it down fairly easily. Wounds 12 is a decent amount of wounds, but really, if you think about it, it's not that much. Especially when you're going up against weapons that are doing D6 plus 1 or D6 plus 2 damage, you do have to make sure that it is safe at all times. As for its ranged weapons, its Prism cannon has 2 profiles on it, one massive anti-large profile with 2 attacks, strength 18, AP -4 and damage 6, and that's flat damage 6, not D6, so you know that you'll be getting 6 damage through for every failed save. And it has an anti-infantry profile with 2d6 attacks, strength 6, AP -1, and damage 2. It also has blast, so that means that the larger the unit you're shooting at, the more attacks you'll get. And this makes the Fire Prism a pretty versatile platform and still a popular choice among players to this day, even despite the nerfs, because no matter what you're going to go against, you know that you have something to deal with their, enemy infantry or their vehicles, right? So either way. And even though the anti-infantry profile isn't that great, you can boost it in a number of ways to make it stronger. As far as its other ranged weapons, it does get to replace the Shuriken catapults with the Shuriken cannon if you want to. The Shuriken cannon is obviously more damage, but the twin Shuriken catapult allows an advanced move and to score secondaries, so it's really up to you which way you go. I prefer the Shuriken cannon, but that's just my personal taste. I like to have a little bit more damage in the late game, but some players might want to use it for that secondary scoring potential, which makes sense, It is usually just in the back hanging out, but there are opportunities throughout a game, especially if you're using these things from reserve, where a Shuriken catapult can come in handy. As for its melee weapons, it basically has the standard Wraithbone hold that all grab tanks have, which is good. I mean, it's nothing special, but it's the standard strength, so you can get a decent tank shock off on it, which is probably the best you can hope for with the Wraithbone hull. As far as its abilities go, it has arguably the best datasheet ability in the entire index. Again, arguably, right, at damage dealing, because it has the Crystal Matrix, so it gets to reroll a hit roll and a wound roll, making it extremely efficient, especially when combined with our detachment bonus Unparalleled Foresight, which essentially means you're getting a full set of rerolls to hit and rerolls to wound on your main gun, your focused lance. So it makes it extremely efficient, and because it has flat damage, you don't need to rely on strands of ice to make this thing powerful. And of course, like all large tanks, it does get damaged when it has 1 to 4 wounds remaining. But the good thing about Eldar tanks is that you're probably not going to have to worry about this special rule, because if it's that low on wounds, it's probably going to die pretty soon. Typically speaking, Eldar tanks are not tough enough to survive out in the open, so you won't have to worry about this that much. This has only come up in one of my games, and it really didn't even come into play because of all the rerolls that the Fire Prism gets. And like I said before, its war gear options are basically it can replace its Shuriken Catapult with a Shuriken Cannon. The choice is really yours. Both of them are pretty viable in my mind as for a secondary weapon. Now, the points cost of this thing is 180, which is pretty massive compared to what it was previously. Previously, 150 was probably a little bit too cheap, and 125 was a joke. When I saw that for the first time, the first thing I thought to myself was, obviously people are going to be running 3 of these things. And, they did, because it was so cheap and so efficient. But at 180, it's not that points efficient, especially against other, big targets. So it really needs to pull a lot of weight for it to be truly worth it. And that usually means coupling it with another Fire Prism because of that linked fire ability that the Prism Cannon has. So I think I missed this earlier in my description, but the Focus Lances also has the linked fire ability, which allows it to draw line of sight and range through another Fire Prism on the battlefield, which of course gives it a lot of versatility in what targets it can actually select. As for the keywords, it has the fly and vehicle keyword, of course. So the fly keyword does make it difficult to maneuver due to its large size. It is slightly smaller than things like a Wave Serpent or a Falcon, so you do have to keep that in mind, especially because of the giant prism cannon on top. But, typically I haven't had that much of an issue maneuvering it around, but there are some scenarios where it might have trouble fitting through some narrow passageways. So as far as its strengths and weaknesses go as a platform, it is very Fate Dice independent, which comes with built-in rerolls and flat damage. And again, this is really strong, right? If you have a model in your army that does a high amount of damage to enemy large targets, and you really don't need to invest Fate Dice in it, that means you can invest those Fate Dice elsewhere and can give you a big leg up on those different parts of the battlefield, which is a pretty big deal. It also has very high-powered weapons that are reliable. Even the blast is pretty decent. It is 2d6, so that's a lot of swing potential. But, it does have blast, which means against the right targets, it's going to get more attacks, and the rerolls do still come in handy there. Also, its long range and the ability to fire through other prisms allows for some superb angles on enemy hard targets, and you really just don't have this ability elsewhere in the game. This is a very unique ability that is unique to the Fire Prism, and unless you're talking about Thousand Suns who can draw line of sight through other sorcerers for certain abilities and things like that, you really just don't see this. Which is really awesome, right? It's really awesome to have a unit that has a unique ability in an edition where arguably a lot of the units have similar abilities throughout every army, right? Sticky objectives is common to every army. Things like rerolls to hit on an objective, that is common to every army. Linked fire is not common. It is a specific weapon rule for the Fire Prism. And linked fire is not just good for getting line of sight on typical targets, but it's also a good way to get around things like Bellicor's, 18-inch lone operative aura and other lone operative abilities. So if you are running a triple prism list, keep in mind that you can in fact move one of the prisms into range of the ability, which is 18, just inside of it, and shoot the other fire prisms, no matter how far away they are, into Bellicor. Because not only can you draw line of sight from the prism, but you also draw range from the prism as well. And another quick thing that some of you guys might not know, but when you advance a fire prism, that does not make it ineligible to be a target for linked fire. So you can actually move and advance a fire prism up the battlefield to get the perfect angle on an enemy unit and still use it as a target for your other fire prisms to be able to shoot through, because there's no place in the linked fire rule that says that the target of the fire prism, target of linked fire, has to be eligible to shoot, right? Only the fire prism that is actually shooting needs to be eligible, obviously. So do look out for some cheeky, line of sight opportunities, when you're measuring your range and you're like, can I'm 16 inches out of being able to draw line of sight on your vehicle. I guess I can't do it. Just keep in mind that you can advance and still fire at least one of your fire prisms through that fire prism into your target. However, as far as its weaknesses go, I just think it really just has one weakness, which is it's very resource intensive. So what I mean by resource intensive isn't just points. It is, 180 points, which is significant. But the other thing is, because Eldar skimmers are very fragile, they need to be hidden, and the fire prism needs direct line of sight and doesn't trade well with other tanks. On average dice, in a straight up fight between a fire prism and an Imperial Guard battle tank, the Imperial Guard battle tank pretty much wins every single time, and that's not because it has more firepower necessarily, it's because it is much tougher as well. So it can weather those attacks much better, live on average dice, and then on average dice kill the fire prism. But of course, we play Eldar. We don't play that game of, stand in front of the enemy and shoot them and let them shoot us back. We're all about the hiding, which does mean we have to spend a little bit of resources on that. So you do have to use fire and fade pretty much every turn if you're shooting a fire prism to make sure that you preserve it. Now, of course, if you can make a good trade against a more expensive target, maybe you don't need the fire and fade as much if you don't have the command points. Maybe you have to use the command points elsewhere in the late game to get an objective, which is totally fine, right? You do have to make those choices, but in general, you are going to have to keep in mind that if you want to keep your prisms alive, you're going to need to spend the command points on fire and fade. Okay, so what about the combos and synergies that you can pull off with the fire prism? So Vipers are really good because they can remove a target's cover to ensure targets are destroyed. A lot of enemy hard targets are going to get a cover save in this edition, especially with the amount of ruins and other, terrain on the battlefield. So removing that cover, making that AP4 way better is going to help you immensely. And a Viper, in my opinion, is worth it when paired with things like prisms to ensure that hard targets are destroyed and your opponent doesn't get lucky and roll a bunch of 5+ or 6+, which does happen. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've shot bright lances or fusion guns at enemy vehicles and they're saving on a 5+ or 6+ and they get those saves. Right, so it does happen. Vipers are really useful for removing those cover saves. Shroud Runners are also good, which give them lethal hits, which can be great with the Disperse Pulse. Again, it's not so helpful for the, focus lances, but when you're going against infantry, especially large infantry blocks like orcs, being able to give something lethal hits is pretty good. Other prisms can also draw line of sight and range from it, which is great. I would always recommend taking at least 2 prisms in your list just because of the fact that it increases the amount of viability that those prisms will have. Being able to draw line of sight through each other means better lines of fire and, obviously angles of line of sight on squishier targets that your opponent doesn't want you to be able to kill. Guide isn't bad either when making sure the Disperse Pulse hits as hard as possible in the late stages of the game. And again, this isn't super great, but, having 2 rerolls to hit and to wound in the late stages of the game just might not be quite enough to eliminate that unit of Marines on an objective. So throwing Guide on a fire prism like this just to ensure that you get those rolls that you need isn't a bad option for the late stages of the game. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a little bit of a bonus tactic that I forgot to mention in the overview. And that's strictly because I don't think a lot of you guys realize how clutch Bladestorm can be in certain situations, especially with things like anti-large weaponry. So bright lances, pulse lasers, things like that. Now, the reason why I bring this up is simply due to the fact that a lot of us have the, and for the most part, correct idea that the more shots you have, the more chances you have of proccing Bladestorm and critical wounds. So therefore, Bladestorm is better on, targets that are anti-infantry focused. Which is true, right? I mean, you don't want to technically have to waste fate dice when your opponent doesn't have a high chance of saving anyway on a high AP attack like a Bright Lance or a Fusion Gun or, of course, the focus lances of a Fire Prism. However, having said that, I have lost games before because my opponent was able to make 2 saves of a 6+ in a row on an objective against Bright Lance Fire. Or against, fusion guns from Fire Dragons and things like that. It happens, right? So I think something you guys need to keep in mind is if you really need something dead, Bladestorm is still an option for things like the Fire Prism. And the reason being is that although AP -4 does normally strip away most of your opponent's armor, it doesn't strip away a 2+ save completely. If your opponent has a 2+ save, AP -4 is going to reduce them to a 6+. And that can be extremely annoying and frustrating if your opponent makes one of the 2 saves you force on them. So Focus Lances has 2 shots, you're probably going to hit, you're probably going to wound, very high chances of that, right? So 9 times out of 10, your opponent is going to get the chance to save their tank on 2 rolls of a 6+, because of that flat damage 6, and because most tanks have wounds 12. I can't tell you how many times my opponent has rolled those 2 dice and one of them comes up a 6. So if you really do need something destroyed and can't risk your opponent rolling that 1 5+ or 1 6+ on 2 dice that it's going to take for them to survive and capture an objective. And by the way, if you have nothing to back it up and you're going purely on averages and not going for overkill, that Dreadnought or that Rhino or whatever it was on that objective is going to score your opponent some primary victory points. So it may be worth it to invest the fate dice and a command point to guarantee that at least 6 wounds goes through on your opponent. So they're not rolling 2 dice and one of them has to be a 6. They're only rolling 1 dice and that has to be a 6. It greatly reduces the chance that your opponent will actually be able to save that model. And again, this is something that is very situational. It's not going to happen all the time. Like if you have a Fire Prism firing at a target and you have another Fire Prism, and maybe you don't care if you have to waste a little bit of extra firepower to kill that vehicle, then yeah, you probably don't need this, right? But if you only have one Fire Prism that can afford to shoot at one tank and then your other Fire Prism has to shoot at something else, then you may want to think about using Blade Storm. Because even though Fire Prisms don't normally need Fate Dice to operate efficiently, you are going to give your opponent most of the time a 6+ armor save, and that's if they don't have an invul save. If they have an invul save, there's really nothing you can do about it. You're just going to have to hope that they fail it. But if they have armor, they have a 6+ or 5+ in cover, you'll be lucky to have that -2 extra AP. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and talk about the deployment and reserve shenanigans that you can pull with Fire Prisms and why this unlocks the key to their true potential. So whether running 2 or 3 Prisms, putting one of them in reserve with the possibility of rapid ingressing can essentially guarantee that you can always get great angles of fire on enemy vulnerable targets. And this is something that a lot of players have asked me about. Proxy Hammer, how do you deal with units in the back that just hide, like Plague Burst Crawlers, or, things like Basilisks, from Imperial Guard, basically indirect fire that I can't interact with on a normal level. And I can't score my secondaries because my opponent blows away my Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders in a couple turns, and I really can't get to their indirect fire because they have a bunch of infantry or other units blocking me from getting there. And there's a couple of different answers, right? I did a video on the Crimson Hunter. The Crimson Hunter can do it. There's a couple of other things that can do it. But one of the things that can reliably get to your opponent's backline stuff, if planned out properly, is the Fire Prism. So essentially what you do with the Fire Prism is you put one of them in reserve. It doesn't matter if you're running 2 or 3 of them. It's irrelevant. You put one of them in reserve and you keep it there. On turn 1, typically your opponent is not going to reveal their toughest targets. So 180 points for a Fire Prism, peeking its head out to basically shoot at infantry is probably not worth the command points you need to use Fire and Fade for. However, by turn 2, that's when things really start to heat up because opponents have to, capture objectives. They have to score on their primaries, right? They have to move up the battlefield to score secondary objectives that they're drawing. Things like that. And it's during that turn that you're going to be able to find an opening for a Fire Prism coming in via rapid ingress or just normally from reserve. And if you wait until turn 3, your Prism can come in from your opponent's board edge, which means indirect fire stuff that was just sitting in their deployment zone shooting at your Aspect Warriors. All of a sudden, they're going to be vulnerable to Fire Prisms coming in from behind and wiping them out, right? Because in turn 3, you can come in from your opponent's board edge. And again, your opponent isn't going to be everywhere at once. Unless you are losing the game really badly, your opponent's not going to be able to come in certain places. And especially if you prepare for this ahead of time by destroying the units that your opponent is going to screen you out with, you can pretty much guarantee that at least by the second and third turn, you'll have units available to come in and wipe your opponent's units off the face of the planet. And in some situations, if you're running a triple prism, you can even put 2 of them in reserve for some insane angles, making it almost impossible to screen effectively. And if your opponent does screen out most of the board and maybe you can't fit both of the prisms in, well, you can always put one of the prisms just in your own deployment zone. It's not really a big deal, and they can draw a line of sight through each other that way. And the other thing to note is that although it may seem like a bad idea to put such a high value target in reserve that can't shoot the first turn, most likely your opponent isn't going to give you those easy targets turn 1 anyway. So, and if, your opponent does give you those easy targets, 1 prism and Warwalkers should be enough to handle them anyway. So there's not a big downside to keeping a fire prism in reserve for the aforementioned reasons, but there's a huge upside because not only is your opponent going to have to worry about that fire prism coming in later and adjust their movement accordingly, which could be to your advantage, but their more vulnerable targets will be open to you later on in the game. Alright, so what is the role of fire prisms in an Eldar army and how do you make the most out of them? Well, fire prisms are a versatile damage platform that specializes in destroying the heaviest enemy armor without the aid of fate dice, which is an important mention, right? I mean, I know I told you guys about that tactic with the Blade Storm that is very situational, but can help you, eliminate the chance of your opponent making a save at an inopportune moment, because for the most part, the fire prism is very fate dice independent, whereas other things like Bright Lances, and, I love Bright Lances, are great, but they do have a bad habit of rolling those 1s on damage when you need them to roll a 3+. And the Fire Prism just doesn't have to worry about that because it just has a flat 6 damage. So there's no possibility of you rolling too low to end up killing that enemy vehicle or monster. Also, while beginner friendly, because, I think the Fire Prism is actually one of the more beginner friendly models for the Eldar. You deploy it in the backfield, you shoot at enemy targets downrange. It's very beginner friendly. And then of course you use fire and fade on it. It goes back behind terrain and it's safe from enemy shooting. However, even though it is very beginner friendly, and I say that with quotes because obviously the Eldar are not a very beginner friendly army, the Fire Prism is probably the easier model to use in our lineup. It has a really high skill cap for experienced players as well. Simply due to the fact that if you're able to use reserves correctly to get the best line of sight angles, it can be extremely rewarding and very skill dependent. And as you unlock the Fire Prism secrets, they will become much more powerful in your army. So yeah, while they are good just sitting back behind terrain at a line of sight, popping out and then popping back in with fire and fade, their true strength lies in being able to exploit their linked fire ability for maximum damage against, units that your opponent thought was safe. Alright, so in conclusion, while no longer at the absolute pinnacle of cost effectiveness, if used correctly, they can be very powerful anti-large platforms that are actually very versatile as well with their dispersed shot pulse. And to really get the most out of them, you have to know how to leverage reserves for better angles and utilize Blade Storm for those, rare opportunities when you really need that little bit of extra AP to ensure that an enemy large target goes down. And if you can master those 2 things, they're going to be a lot better for the cost because they are still expensive, right? They are still 180 points. There is an argument that they're not quite cost effective anymore for the damage that they can put out compared to things like Bright Lances. And that's why you really do have to be clever when using them because, they are a big point sink and they are going to cost you a lot of resources throughout the game. So you do have to revolve your game plan around them. And I'm going to make a quick prediction here because I don't think Fire Prisms are going to be in the line of fire for nerfs coming up. And I think that if GW decides to nerf Unparalleled Foresight or change our, detachment bonus in any way, I think because of the fact that Fire Prisms get natural rerolls, we might see a small resurgence of Fire Prisms in competitive lists. But we'll see. Personally, I don't think GW is going to touch our detachment bonus, but some players seem to think that they will, and who knows, they might actually do it, because that's something that a lot of players have complained about, said it's too strong or whatever. So if it does get touched, I can definitely see Fire Prisms being more valuable. So just a little bit of a prediction for the data slate. And obviously it is coming out pretty soon, and I will cover that pretty in depth when it does come out. So just stay tuned for that within the next week or so. And I think that's going to be it for today's video. So thank you so much for watching. And, thank you so much to all my Patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year as well. Your help has truly grown the community in ways I can't even describe. So thank you so much. If you do want to become a member of the community and support the channel, I have free trials on Patreon activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. So if you want to come join our Discord community and have conversations with me about tactics or Eldar or whatever, or other members of our Discord, definitely check out that link in the description. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you do want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel on my channel store page to rep at your local game store, or get some discounted Eldar miniatures through Amazon, check out those links in the description as well. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Once again, thanks for watching. Have some great games this weekend. And personally, I actually tomorrow, by the way, have a game of Old World against, one of my buddies in the gaming group who has an Orcs and Goblins army. And while I don't have any models, he said he would help me with some proxies and movement trays and stuff like that. He really wants to get a game in. I told him I'd play him because I wanted to see how it works out and, what the rules are and stuff like that. I've read through the rules, but there's something different about playing a real game, right? So we're going to be playing a 2,000 point game, and I'm pretty familiar with fantasy and how it works and stuff too, because I played Warhammer Fantasy for such a long time. So, we're going to settle some grudges tomorrow. And I'll let you guys know about what I think about the game in general and the different units in the Dwarf Army book within the next week. And I'll kind of try to do some sort of review on Old World. I know a lot of you guys out there listening to my Eldar content probably hate my opinions about Old World, but I have to say I'm just trying to keep it real with you guys, and I'm not trying to sink the hype train or crash the hype train that is Old World. But at the same time, if there's something that's not really great about it, I do want to let you guys know my honest feelings and opinions about that. So anyway, I'll let you guys know about that within the next week. Expect a couple of Old World videos coming up. And, obviously if the Eldar, nerfs come before that, then that's going to be prioritized. So anyway, have a good one, everybody. Have some good games, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.